Montana Territory, November 1887. Nobody noticed what was happening in that cabin. From the outside, it looked like every other homestead along Bitterroot Creek. Weathered pine logs, a stone chimney leaking thin smoke, a small woodshed leaning against the north wall. But beneath the floorboards, something unusual was taking shape. Something that would challenge everything the settlement thought they knew about surviving winter at 6,000 feet. By the time anyone understood what Sarah Hutchins had built, it was already too late to laugh. This is the story of a quiet innovation born not from genius, but from necessity. A solution so simple that experienced builders dismissed it, so practical that it became invisible, and so effective that when the coldest winter in 40 years arrived, it separated survival from catastrophe. If you want to learn one frontier technique every week that actually worked when lives depended on it, subscribe now. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what you're about to see might change how you think about shelter itself. Sarah Hutchins wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She was 32 years old in the autumn of 1887, a widow with 2 children, 8-year-old Emma and 5-year-old Daniel. Her husband, a timber cutter, had died in a logging accident the previous spring, leaving her with a quarter-section claim, a modest cabin, and debts to the general store that wouldn't wait for spring. The cabin was solid enough. 14 feet by 18. Chinked logs, a riverstone fireplace that drew reasonably well. Plank floor raised 6 inches off the ground on cedar posts. By the standards of Bitterroot Creek, it was respectable. Not wealthy, but livable. Until winter. The problem wasn't the walls. It was the floor. Every morning from late October onward, frost formed on the inside of the floorboards. The children woke shivering, their breath visible in the dim light. Sarah would wrap them in every quilt she owned and set them near the fire while she cooked cornmeal mush, but the cold radiated up through the planks like the earth itself was pulling heat from their bodies. She burned through firewood faster than she could split it. The wind howled beneath the raised floor, turning the crawl space into a frozen wind tunnel. At night, even with the fire banked and glowing, the temperature inside the cabin dropped low enough that water in the wash basin froze solid. She tried everything the neighbors suggested. Packed straw beneath the floor, hung canvas along the foundation, burned bigger fires. Nothing worked. The cold came from below, relentless and bone-deep. By mid-November, Daniel developed a wet cough that wouldn't clear. Emma's fingers turned white at the tips when she helped carry firewood. Sarah herself barely slept, waking every 2 hours to feed the fire, terrified that if it died, her children would freeze before dawn. One night, lying awake while wind rattled the shutters, Sarah made a decision. She was going to dig. Not a root cellar, not a storm shelter, something else. A room beneath the cabin floor where the earth itself would hold warmth. A space insulated by 6 feet of soil, protected from wind, heated passively by the cabin above. She didn't have a name for it. She just knew that if she could get her children below ground level, they'd survive. She told no one, not because she was secretive by nature, but because she didn't want advice. She didn't want someone explaining why it wouldn't work, or why it was improper, or why a woman with 2 children shouldn't be digging beneath her own home. She just wanted her children warm. The next morning, before dawn, she began. Sarah started in the northwest corner of the cabin, directly beneath where the children's bed stood. She pried up 3 floorboards, exposing the hard-packed earth below. And she began to dig, not with ambition, just methodically, 1 shovelful at a time. She worked in the early mornings and late evenings, when the children were occupied or asleep. The dirt came up in frozen clumps at first, but once she got below 8 inches, the soil softened. She wasn't building randomly. She had a plan. The room would be 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and just tall enough for her to sit upright, about 4.5 feet from floor to ceiling. She would line the walls with river stone to prevent collapse and to store radiant heat from the cabin floor above. A narrow ladder made from peeled lodgepole pine would provide access. Ventilation would come from a small clay pipe angled up through the foundation, disguised as drainage. She understood something that most people building above ground didn't consider. The Earth 5 feet down stays roughly the same temperature year-round. In Montana, that meant around 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold by indoor standards, but far warmer than the 10 below nights outside. And if heat from the cabin seeped down through the floorboards, the underground room could reach 55 or even 60 degrees without burning a single stick of extra firewood. It was passive heating, thermal mass, geothermal stability. She didn't use those terms. She just called it staying below the wind. The excavation took 3 weeks. She dug at night, mostly carrying the dirt out in a canvas sack and spreading it thin across her garden plot so no one would notice a pile. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached, but the hole grew steadily deeper. By early December, she had a space large enough to work inside. She began laying stones. River rock, mostly rounded pieces of granite and basalt she'd gathered from the creek bed over the summer. She dry-stacked them carefully, wedging smaller stones into gaps, creating walls that wouldn't shift or crumble. The stones were cold to the touch at first, but she knew that once the room warmed, they'd hold that heat for hours. She left a small alcove in the south wall for an oil lamp. She built a wooden platform along one side for bedding. 2 wool-stuffed mattresses she'd sewn from flour sacks. She installed the ventilation pipe, angling it so moisture could drain out and fresh air could seep in. The final step was insulation. She packed the gap between the stone walls and the surrounding earth with dry pine needles and shredded bark, materials that wouldn't rot quickly and would trap air. Then she relayed the floorboards above, leaving only a 2-foot square trapdoor concealed beneath a woven rug. From inside the cabin, you couldn't tell anything had changed. From below, it was a small, stone-lined sanctuary. Dark, quiet, and warm enough that frost wouldn't form. She tested it on a night when the temperature outside dropped to 8 degrees. She climbed down with a candle and sat on the bedding platform for 20 minutes. The air was still, slightly musty but breathable, and noticeably warmer than the cabin above. It worked. She didn't tell anyone, not the neighbors, not the men at the timber camp. Not even the children, not yet. She wanted to be sure. She wanted one full cold snap to prove it wasn't just luck. But word travels in small ways. People noticed Sarah digging, even if they didn't know why. Old Mr. Calloway, who lived a quarter-mile downstream, saw her hauling dirt one evening and called over. "You got a drainage problem, Mrs. Hutchins?" "Just improving the foundation," she said. He nodded, uninterested, and moved on. A week later, 2 women from the church stopped by with a basket of preserved apples. One of them glanced at the dirt scattered across the garden and frowned. "You preparing a root cellar?" "Something like that." The women exchanged a look. "Bit late in the season for that kind of work," one said. "Ground will freeze soon." Sarah thanked them for the apples and didn't explain further. At the general store, when she bought candles and lamp oil, the clerk, a man named Horace who fancied himself an expert on homesteading, made a comment. "Heard you've been doing some digging under your place." "I have. Hope you're not trying to add a cellar under the cabin itself. That's a fool's errand. Foundational shift. Floral sag. Seen it happen." Sarah paid for her goods and left. No one was hostile. No one tried to stop her. But the tone was clear. What she was doing seemed odd. Unnecessary. Maybe even a little desperate. Women didn't dig under their cabins. People build out, not down. And if you needed more space, you added a lean-to or waited for spring. Digging beneath a cabin sounded like something a person did when they didn't know better. Jacob Stern, a carpenter who'd built half the structures in the settlement, happened by one afternoon while Sarah was reinforcing the trapdoor. He watched for a moment, then shook his head. "You making a hiding spot for something?" "A sleeping space," Sarah said evenly. He laughed, not meanly but dismissively. "Sleeping underground? Like a prairie dog?" He shook his head again. "Cold rises, Mrs. Hutchins. He don't go down. You're working against nature." She didn't argue. She just kept hammering. Jacob walked away muttering something about women and ideas. By mid-December, a few people in the settlement had heard about Sarah's hole. It became a minor curiosity, a strange project from a widow who probably didn't know what else to do with her time. No one thought it was dangerous. No one thought it mattered. It was just odd, and Sarah was fine with that. She wasn't looking for approval. She was looking for warmth. On December 18th, she moved the children's bedding down into the underground room for the first time. Emma was hesitant. "It's dark, Mama." "It's warm," Sarah said. Daniel, bundled in a wool sweater, climbed down the ladder first. He touched the stone walls, surprised. "It's not cold." Sarah lit the oil lamp and tucked them in. The air was still. No drafts, no wind rattle, just stone, earth, and silence. That night, the temperature outside dropped to 12 degrees. Inside the cabin, near the fire, it was maybe 50, but in the underground room, wrapped in quilts with the trapdoor closed, it stayed near 58. The children slept through the night without shivering once. Sarah sat by the fire above, listening to the wind, and allowed herself a small, tired smile. It worked, but winter was just beginning. The storm arrived on January 11th, 1888. It started as light snow in the morning, nothing unusual for Montana in midwinter. By afternoon, the wind picked up, driving the flakes horizontal across the valley. By evening, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet, and by midnight, the temperature had fallen to 6 degrees below zero. It kept falling. By the second day, it was 18 below. By the third day, 24 below. The wind howled out of the north at 30 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that made exposed skin freeze in under a minute. Snow piled 4 feet deep against the north walls of every cabin in the settlement. Drifts climbed to the roof lines. It was the kind of storm people talked about for the rest of their lives. Firewood, which had been abundant in the fall, was now buried or frozen solid. Men who'd stacked greenwood outside found it wouldn't light. The logs were too cold, too damp. Fires sputtered and smoked. Chimneys clogged with creosote. Some families burned furniture just to keep a flame going. Sarah's woodshed was nearly empty by the end of the first week. She'd rationed carefully, but the cabin bled heat faster than she could replace it. The fire roared constantly, consuming split pine and willow, but the cold pressed in from every direction. The windows glazed over with ice on the inside. Frost crept across the walls. The water bucket froze solid within an hour of being filled. On the 8th night of the storm, the temperature inside the cabin, despite the fire, dropped to 38 degrees. Sarah made a decision. She banked the fire low, just enough to keep the chimney warm and prevent downdrafts. Then she gathered the children, wrapped them in every blanket she had, and led them down the ladder into the underground room. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just save her family. It changed how the entire settlement understood what shelter really means. Emma carried the oil lamp. Daniel clung to his mother's skirt. They descended into the dark, stone-lined space, and Sarah pulled the trapdoor shut above them. Immediately, the wind noise stopped. The underground room was dim, lit only by the single oil lamp, but it was still, completely still. No drafts, no rattling shutters, no ice forming on the walls. Sarah checked the thermometer she'd hung on the stone wall, a small instrument she'd bought for 50 cents at the store. 53 degrees. Outside, it was 26 below zero with wind. Inside the cabin above, it was 38. But here, 5 feet underground with nothing but earth and stone around them, it was 53 degrees. She tucked the children into the bedding platform. They didn't shiver. They didn't complain. Daniel fell asleep within minutes, his breath steady and calm. Emma read quietly by lamplight, her fingers steady enough to turn pages without trembling. Sarah sat on the edge of the platform and listened to the silence. The storm raged for another 4 days. During that time, Sarah climbed up into the cabin only twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, to feed the fire just enough to keep it alive. She'd spend 15 minutes up there, shivering, then retreat back underground. The rest of the time, they lived below. They ate cold cornbread and dried apples. They told stories. They slept, and they stayed warm. On the 12th day, the wind finally stopped. The temperature climbed to 10 above zero, practically balmy by comparison. Snow glittered under a clear sky. The settlement began to dig out, and that's when people started noticing. The first person to notice was Margaret Briggs, a neighbor who lived 3 cabins downstream. She came by on the 13th day after the storm began, carrying a jar of beef broth she'd managed to keep from freezing. She knocked on Sarah's door, expecting to find a cold cabin and a desperate family. Instead, she found Sarah calm, the children playing quietly near a low fire, and the cabin noticeably warmer than her own. "How much wood have you burned?" Margaret asked, glancing at the nearly empty woodshed outside. "Less than I expected," Sarah said. Margaret frowned. Her own family had burned through 2 cords trying to keep their cabin livable. Her husband had frostbite on 3 fingers. Her youngest son had developed chilblains so severe he couldn't walk without crying. "Your children look, well," Margaret said, studying Emma and Daniel. Their cheeks were pink. Their hands weren't chapped. They didn't have the gray, exhausted look that most children in the settlement had developed after 12 days of brutal cold. "We managed," Sarah said. Margaret left confused. 2 days later, Jacob Stern, the carpenter who'd mocked Sarah's digging, stopped by to check on her. He expected to find her struggling. Instead, he found her splitting kindling outside, her children playing in the snow, all of them dressed warmly but not desperately. "You made it through," he said, surprised. "We did. How much firewood you got left?" Sarah gestured at the shed. "Maybe a quarter cord. For most families, that would have been gone by day 4 of the storm." Jacob looked at the cabin, then at the chimney. The smoke was thin, barely visible. He'd been burning 3 times as much wood just to keep his own place above freezing. "What did you do different?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. Then she said, "We stayed below the wind." He didn't understand at first. Then he remembered. The hole. The sleeping space she'd dug. "You used it." "We did." Jacob studied her for a long moment. "And it worked. It kept us warm." That afternoon, Jacob told his wife. His wife told Margaret Briggs. Margaret told the pastor's wife. By evening, half the settlement had heard that Sarah Hutchins and her children had survived the worst storm in memory by sleeping underground. The next morning, Horace from a general store came by. Not to sell anything, just to see. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Hutchins?" "Of course." "How warm was it?" "Down there." Sarah thought for a moment. 53 degrees. Most nights. Horace blinked. His cabin, even with a roaring fire, had barely reached 45 during the worst of the storm. "And you didn't burn extra wood?" "I banked the fire low, just enough to keep the chimney warm." "And the cold didn't come up from the ground?" "No, the earth held the warmth." Horace left without another word. But 2 days later, he was back with a notebook, asking technical questions. How deep did she dig? What kind of stone? How did she ventilate it? How thick were the walls? Sarah answered patiently. She showed him the trapdoor, the ladder, the stone lining. She explained how the earth 5 feet down stayed stable in temperature, how the stone absorbed radiant heat from the cabin floor above, how the insulation trapped air. Horace took notes. Then he asked, "Could I build one?" "I don't see why not." Within a week, 3 families had started digging. The numbers were impossible to ignore. During the 12-day storm, most families in the Bitterroot Creek settlement burned between 2 and 3 cords of firewood trying to keep their cabins livable. Temperatures inside, even with constant fires, range from 35 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah burned less than half a cord, and her underground room stayed between 52 and 56 degrees, warmer than most cabins with fires blazing. The thermal efficiency was dramatic. The earth itself acted as insulation, buffering against the wild temperature swings outside. The stone walls stored radiant heat during the day and released it slowly at night. The lack of wind meant no convective heat loss. And because the space was small and low-ceilinged, body heat alone contributed 2 to 3 degrees of warmth. It wasn't magic. It was physics. But to people who'd spent 12 days shivering despite burning through their winterwood supply, it felt like a revelation. By late January, the pastor mentioned it in a Sunday sermon, not as a miracle, but as an example of practical wisdom. Sometimes, he said, the best answers are the ones we overlook because they seem too simple. Jacob Stern, the carpenter who'd laughed at Sarah's digging, publicly apologized. "I was wrong," he told her after church. "I thought heat didn't go down. Turns out it does, and it stays there." Sarah nodded. She didn't gloat. She didn't lecture. She just said, "It worked for us. Maybe it'll work for others." And it did. The technique spread quietly, the way good ideas do in small communities. Jacob Stern built an underground sleeping space beneath his own cabin that spring. He used Sarah's design almost exactly. River stone walls, dry-stacked and packed with bark insulation, a small ventilation shaft, a trapdoor hidden beneath a rug. The following winter, his family used it every night from November through March. He later told the settlement council that it cut his firewood consumption by nearly 60%. Margaret Briggs didn't dig beneath her cabin. The foundation was too shallow, but she built a partially buried addition on the north side, with stone walls sunk 3 feet into the earth and a sod roof for extra insulation. It worked almost as well. By the winter of 1889, 7 families near Bitterroot Creek had some version of Sarah's design. Some dug full rooms. Others created smaller sleeping alcoves. A few combined the idea with root cellars, using the same space for food storage and emergency shelter. The settlement didn't adopt it universally. Some people still preferred above-ground living, and that was fine. But the option was there now, proven and practical for anyone willing to dig. What made it spread wasn't salesmanship. It was results. People saw that Sarah's children stayed healthier through the winter. They noticed her wood supply lasted longer. They watched her survive storms that broke other families. And they thought, if it works for her, maybe it'll work for me. The technique adapted to local conditions. In areas with high water tables, people built raised sleeping platforms with earth berms instead of full excavations. In rockier soil, they used timber cribbing instead of stone walls. In places where ventilation was difficult, they installed double-pipe systems to ensure airflow. By 1892, the Bitterroot Creek settlement had a reputation in the territory for earth-smart building. Visitors noticed that fewer families struggled with winter fuel shortages. Fewer children developed respiratory illnesses from constant exposure to wood smoke. Fewer cabins showed signs of desperate overheating. Cracked chimneys, scorched walls, burned-out fireboxes. It wasn't revolutionary. It was incremental. But over time, those increments added up. Sarah herself never promoted the idea. She didn't write articles or give lectures. She simply lived her life, raised her children, and answered questions when people asked. The underground room became part of her cabin's identity, not a novelty, but a feature. When she eventually remarried in 1894, her new husband, a schoolteacher named William Draper, slept there without complaint. "It's warmer than the rectory I grew up in," he said. The children grew up considering it normal. Emma later built a similar space beneath her own homestead in Idaho. Daniel, who became a stonemason, incorporated earth shelter designs into several public buildings in Missoula. By the early 1900s, the practice had spread beyond Bitterroot Creek. Homesteaders in Wyoming, North Dakota, and Alberta reported using Montana-style sleeping cellars to reduce heating costs. Agricultural extension agents began recommending partial earth sheltering for livestock barns and workshops. This secret bedroom wasn't secret anymore. It was just smart. And it all started because one woman, facing a cold floor and dwindling firewood, decided to dig. Not to prove a point, not to challenge convention, just to keep her children warm. Sarah Hutchins didn't invent earth-sheltered living. Humans have been using the thermal stability of underground spaces for thousands of years, from the pit houses of the ancestral Puebloans to the dugouts of the Great Plains, from the Icelandic turf homes to the Japanese Hanawa storage pits. What Sarah did was remember something that modern building practices had started to forget. The earth itself is a resource. At a time when most frontier families were focused on building up taller cabins, bigger fireplaces, more wood, she looked down. She trusted the ground beneath her feet to do what it had always done: hold steady. The result wasn't just survival. It was efficiency. A 50% reduction in firewood consumption. A 15-degree temperature difference during the worst cold snaps. A shelter that required less maintenance, less fuel, and less desperation. It didn't require advanced engineering. It required observation, patience, and a willingness to work with nature instead of against it. That's the lesson here. Not every solution needs to be complex. Not every innovation needs to be loud. Sometimes the best answer is the one that's been under your feet the whole time. If you found this story valuable, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week we uncover one more technique that our ancestors used to survive when failure was an option. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? The frontier is full of forgotten wisdom. Let's remember it together. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature, and it does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.